So my first question would be about World Forum. What do you see as the challenges between research and housing practice? Where do you see the opportunities and challenges?
Well, I think through research on housing we do manage sometimes to influence policies, and that's what we also aim at. I mean, we are a research institute that does both fundamental research, like more like Swiss National Science Foundation funded research projects, so where maybe the direct impact on policies is not so obvious, but we do also research projects, let's say for the municipality of Zurich or for the State Secretariat of Housing, and there of course there is a very direct interest in I mean, it's our ambition, and it's also what is demanded from us to come up with evidences that can help maybe to improve certain policies. For instance, just to give you an example, we have now been asked by the Swiss Federal Office for Housing. There was a motion in the parliament that there is an issue of racial discrimination in the housing market, and they now want us to do a more thorough investigation about what can be done against the racial discrimination of housing. So that's one example. Or, for instance, the city of Zurich was interested in understanding better, a sort of an evaluation of its housing policies. What are the advantages of supporting housing cooperatives, meaning the production of housing, as opposed to subsidize housing socially weaker groups. So we do work that has an aspiration or that has an impact on policies directly. I don't think, challenges, what should I say? I think sometimes, of course, whether and how actions are being taken to mitigate certain problems ultimately is a political decision which we cannot influence, of course. But I think, for instance, last year we did, what we try to do here also is to combine research, education, and policy advocacy. For instance, last time we have a problem here in Zurich. I don't know whether you have come across that, but we have currently a very rapid demolition of older but affordable housing stock. So last year, what we did with our student, we did a research on some housing stock that was going to be demolished, and we analyzed it in a way, the justification of demolishing this housing from the perspective of the inhabitants, from the perspective of the developers, but then also from an architectural perspective, and what is going to be destroyed, what is going to be built to replace those buildings. And so we analyzed a little bit the costs, social costs, and the benefits by looking at this certain number of variables. And then we made an exhibition. Actually, the poster is still hanging there. It was called Verdichtung und Verdrängung, which means densification and displacement. And yeah, I think that exhibition had a very strong impact, to the extent that, really that was, I think, the most visited exhibition at the Center for Architecture here in Zurich, because obviously the topic now is extremely debated. And yeah, it was a way of creating a debate around this topic. We also organized public meetings with representatives from the Renters Association, the City of Zurich, evicted people. So we really tried here we also tried to really create a dialogue between different stakeholders and actors. And yes, sometimes we have the satisfaction of being able to achieve, maybe have some influence on policies, and sometimes obviously not. But that's the way it is when you do applied research. You know that you cannot always influence policies. You cannot always achieve what you would like to achieve, but at least you can contribute to a critical version, a critical analysis.
And do you work for, as you mentioned, you work for states, like state organizations, but do you also do projects for instance, cooperatives? or
Yes, we do
developers?
very much. We have a very close collaboration with cooperatives, as a matter of fact. Also because I'm also directing this Master of Advanced Studies in Housing, and there what we actually do, we always visit housing cooperatives, and then we ask the housing cooperatives whether there is any topic on which they would like maybe a student to do a master's thesis. And so we had already several students who entered into this type of collaboration with cooperatives and wrote a thesis about a particular subject that was suggested by the housing cooperative itself. In particular with Duyne, we have this collaboration since 5 or 6 years already, then with ABZ, which is the largest cooperative here in Zurich. So that's one way we interact with cooperatives, and then we did very many concrete studies. For instance, also that was also now quite a few years ago, again Barenstein, they were very concerned about how they could include more their, how they could enhance the participation of their inhabitants in collective activities. And so they asked us to do a study to see, what are the measures that could be taken in order to activate the community. So it was a very practical study. It was not, actually it ended up to be a bit more theoretical, because basically we went into we tried to look at what factors determine participation to voluntary initiatives in general. So I think it was an important study, because also to show that participation cannot be taken for granted. Participation means entails transaction costs, and obviously not everybody has the time to dedicate to participation. So I think for them it was also a study that was a bit eye-opening, also in terms of how much participation can you expect, and from whom, tends to participate in what type of activity, and who tends to participate in other. Which one factor that it certainly confirmed and contributed is how important it is to have a socially mixed community in housing cooperatives, because as you certainly know, housing cooperatives in Switzerland are not social housing, it is really a social mix of people. And there I think our study contributed very much to show that you need to have this mix in order for instance, you need higher educated people to take commitments, long-term commitments, maybe at an organizational and administrative level, but lower income people are more spontaneous in participating in a party and in cooking. So, there were, you could see that across the social strata, there are different patterns of participation, and that both are very valuable but different, and that both are needed to make a community work properly. So these are two examples, and then there are cooperatives that have, for instance, a share of apartments, and some years ago that was still quite innovative to have a share of apartments, or maybe one building reserved for elderly people, and so we did some study to analyze whether that worked. So different studies. I mean, in that sense, our collaboration with cooperatives is quite close in many domains, yes.
As you know, we are interested in cooperatives.
Yes.
But I'll come back to one follow-up questions. What do cooperatives mean for Switzerland and for Zurich?
Well, for Switzerland in general, cooperatives, the Switzerland Eidgenossenschaft, the name of the country itself includes this word cooperative. Genossenschaft is Switzerland in Germany. In German it's called Eidgenossenschaft. So there is, let's say, some people would argue that cooperativism is a bit in the DNA of the Swiss population. Whether that is true or not is arguable, but there is certainly, also in rural areas, the commons are managed through cooperatives. So there is this, a bit of a myth, I would rather say, that cooperatives are something, there is a certain Swissness in cooperatives. When it comes to housing cooperatives, you see obviously a very strong divide between rural and urban areas. I mean, at the national level, I think, at the national level, I think it's less than 5% the housing stock of housing cooperatives. You have hardly any cooperatives, for instance, in southern Switzerland, whereas here in Switzerland, no, the cooperatives are very important and are very much, there is a certain awareness about the role of housing cooperatives in the provision of affordable, non-commodifiable housing. You know that we have at present, it's about 22% of the housing stock in Zurich belongs to housing cooperatives, and another 6-7% is foundations, non-profit housing from the city of Zurich. But there is, from the side, you know, there is this policy in Zurich. I mean, the Swiss Zurich population voted that by 250, 1/3 of the housing stock should be non-profit, and the housing cooperatives are the actors through which this policy is being implemented. So in that sense, there is a strong pressure and also and high expectations on housing cooperatives to be the key actors in the provision of non-commodifiable, non-profit housing. It's a challenge to achieve this 1/3 non-profit housing stock by 250 because land shortage. You know, there is no more land available in Zurich. Basically, the land prices are extremely high. So so far, what the city does, it gives land to the cooperatives on a leasehold basis, but that land is gradually disappearing, making it different. And that's also one of the reasons why even cooperatives in some cases demolish their housing stock in order to densify. Of course, there is a big difference between cooperatives and private builders is that cooperatives, I mean, tenants of housing, or members of housing cooperatives, because if you live in a housing cooperative, you are a member of the housing cooperative, they are entitled to an alternative, which is also why the projects of housing cooperatives take quite some time to implement, because of course you first have to find an alternative accommodation for all your members and tenants, which is then the critique that comes from the more right liberal parties that cooperatives are too slow in the production of housing, that the market does better, but yes, at what prices, at what social costs. Yeah.
So with this 33%, 1/3
Yeah,
housing is going to be cooperatives, is there a demand that supports it?
Oh, yes, I mean from the citizens, from the
people.
Oh yes, very much. Yeah. No, now they demand even more because right now we have such a housing crisis in Zurich. I mean, there is a vacancy rate of less than 0.06%. So I mean the housing shortage now is dramatic, and the prices are increasing tremendously. So now it's really just now a new initiative has started that demands even a stronger commitment of the government to make, first of all, to create also rent caps which don't exist to prevent demolitions, to take more actions against this housing crisis, because we see now that this ambitious goal of having 1/3 of the housing stock non-profit by 250 don't manage. Actually, in absolute numbers, the absolute numbers are increasing, but the relative numbers are decreasing. Actually, the percentage of non-profit housing stock is decreasing at present because the private sector is building so much and the cooperatives are having a problem in building. They have a problem in, yes, of course, having this aggressive policy of the private sector, but also the cooperatives is a very heterogeneous movement. Not all cooperatives are, innovative and are driven by the commitment to build more housing. Some cooperatives, once they have built the houses for their members, they are happy and they don't ever build again a second building. So that is also, you have the large ones like Abed said, you probably heard about, they own about 5,000 or more dwellings. But then you have smaller cooperatives that have built one residential building in their whole life cycle. Now some of them are inhabited by very old people or elderly people who don't have the capacity or the motivation to grow. So this is also, one. I mean, when people come to Zurich, they always think that cooperatives are all Kraftwerk, Meereswohnen, and Kalkbreite, but no, that's actually a very small number. That is, I spoke recently to the BBG, the Cooperative Housing Association of Zurich, and they said that actually the ones who are motivated to grow and a dozen out of what is the total number, about 160 or something. So it's not, so the great majority of the cooperatives are neither particularly innovative nor particularly driven by a motivation to build more. So they actually, even the BBG, the housing associations, they said, we fought for our sector to become more powerful, to be more, and now that we have the policy supporting us, we don't have the members taking action. So it's not, it's a very heterogeneous sector also. What they do share, or what the vast majority have in common, is that they are non-profit, non-commodifiable housing. This is something because this is mandatory. In order to members from the cooperative association, they have to subscribe the Charter for Non-Profit Housing, and that is being monitored by the cooperative association.
I think you already answered my next question, but in terms of quality of living and innovation, do you think cooperatives perform better than the private sector?
Yes, I mean it's quite obvious that in general, I mean again, of course, if a cooperative, a lot of the housing stock of the housing cooperatives was built in the 70s, 80s, so that housing stock maybe at that time was of high quality. Now it might be a bit more obsolete, but it's very affordable, and I think that's what really matters for people, and in general the quality is good. But all the new projects, I mean all the projects that are being built in the last 20 years, if in order to access support from the government, be it through land on a leasehold basis, be it through financial support, which might be that the government participates as this municipal government, we are talking always about municipal governments. In order to obtain the support from the municipal government, they need to make an architectural competition, they need to comply with very high environmental standards, they have to have communal spaces, services, and so on and so forth. And through that process, you really achieve a much higher quality. I mean, you see in that sense, there is a difference. And then the very fact that cooperatives build for their own members motivates them to build high quality, durable, and sustainable housing. So in that sense, yes, the housing stock of the cooperatives is definitely of higher standard at any, I mean, if you compare housing built in the same period by the private sector and the public sector, there is a tremendous difference. Yeah.
I think you also said something quite interesting to us, that what you said about standards. When the government gives subsidy, some kind of support, they ask for higher standards. So is it possible to say that it is also the standards that the government makes that increases the standards of quality in
Yes, definitely. Yeah, definitely. The standards are set, I mean, are very much set by the government. They have to comply, and not just with the architectural competition, there are the building regulations, the high environmental standards, so that is really very much demanded. But then also standards in terms of size of the apartments, typology, because in Switzerland, of course, we have really, we are a small country with very limited land resources, so we have a problem of people tending to consume too much space. So there is also the demand of building apartments that are not too large, So the standard has to be, I mean, in a way, the standard should not be too high and not too low. I mean, it should be good quality, good standard, but it should not be deluxe either, I mean, that is also something that they don't want, that housing cooperatives build. It should be middle class, lower middle class housing after all. And in that sense, there are very strict regulations about what the standards should be. So in terms of environmental standards, by all means very high, but it should not be deluxe housing at all. COVID. And yeah, there are rules and regulations regarding the size of the apartment, the rooms. In principle, the cooperatives, the average consumption in terms of square meters is lower than in the private sector. It's like, most cooperatives you're not allowed to consume more than 32.5 or 32 square meters per person. And in the private, and the average consumption in Switzerland is like 47 square meters. And so the challenge and the trick is to achieve the same quality by consuming less space.
And consider, this is again follow-up, considering the new needs coming from the COVID and after COVID, like working from home or working more flexibly, and the climate crisis that comes. Do you think cooperatives are also leading the way in terms of responding to these challenges?
Well, in terms of COVID, during COVID, everybody had this impression that people would change housing preferences. And there was a very minor shift of people moving out to the countryside, people demanding larger apartments. But this trend is not really affecting. We see that on the long term, people are moving back to the usual housing patterns. Yeah, there is more home office, and there is a challenge in cooperatives. Is the issue is that you are not allowed to have more rooms than the number of household members plus one. So you are not allowed to have an office in your house. But then many of the new cooperatives, or the newer cooperatives, they have like communal rooms, and they make, you have the possibility of renting. They have these joker rooms which you might rent, or they have communal spaces where you can work. But what is not allowed in cooperatives is to have your home office as a separate room. So far we haven't seen, in that sense, I wouldn't know of any example that has responded to the changing needs of COVID. But also recent studies showed also that there is not a major long-term impact, I know there is, again, the cooperative Megals Wohnen built a new cooperative in Winterthur, a new housing estate in Winterthur, and they said that during the COVID, but it was a very special moment, they had a bit of problems to rent out the apartments because of the restriction of not allowing one extra room. But I think that's already passed. And people are all too happy if they can get an apartment, Megals Wohnen apartment in Winterthur, because in that sense, the market is so tight now that getting an apartment in a cooperative is really a great privilege, you can say.
From what you said, because cooperatives provide more communal areas, especially those that are built in the past 10, 20 years.
Communal, at least the communal room was already present in the early generation cooperatives. That has always been, like one communal room. Then, maybe the rules are a bit more strict on who can use it, when can it be used, but this communal room, sort of a community hall, is there in almost all cooperatives, also those built in the 60s or so. So that is nothing new. Now it's more diversified use, so you have like these joker rooms and maybe spaces, communal rooms that have not a predefined function, but that can be appropriated by the people or group of tenants. So there is a sort of a more innovative approach towards communal spaces, but this. And then you have maybe shared guest rooms, so more diverse communal rooms. In the good old days, or in the old days, it was just one communal room for having the parties, or the birthday parties, or the annual meetings, or something like that. Plus, of course, outdoor spaces, the playground and gardens, place to hang up your laundry and things like that. That was, so in that sense, this communal element has been there for a very long time.
And we learned that, for instance, laundries and washing machines are very communal in Switzerland. I was wondering if these community halls or communal spaces are also common in private sector?
Washing rooms, yes, absolutely. This is not something unique to housing cooperatives. I mean, in the lower, let's say, lower income segment or even middle income, it's normal to have a common washing room. I mean, it's only yes in the more I mean, of course, housing demands for those who can pay have increased. So in the condominiums, typically everybody has his or her own washing machine. But even in condominiums, everybody has his or her own washing machine, but then you have also communal laundry. So that is very, very typical of Switzerland, and not so typical in other countries, as a matter of fact. But here, I mean, I remember also, when I lived in Zurich in an apartment building, it was quite obvious and normal, and always big discussions, because then you have the plan, and you have to register, and you are not allowed to wash after a certain hour, so it's also a contentious issue. I mean, it's not just fun. But it is very common. I mean, in that sense, I think it's part a bit of a frugal mentality of the Swiss people. And of course, in the past, washing machines were not were a big investment, so it made a lot of sense to share them. But that's very, very common in Switzerland in general. Yeah.
You said there are 160 or somewhere around that cooperatives in Zurich, and only a dozen of them were keen to build new or reach this policy target. How do cooperatives emerge? How do they come together?
Well, I mean, typically it's a group of. You have the old established, but there are newer cooperatives also emerging. I mean, actually, just a former student of us founded a cooperative, and it was very nice because she wrote to us immediately and said, thanks to what I learned in this master's program, I now founded a cooperative. So you have a group, typically a group of motivated citizens who get together and found a cooperative. And of course, and then one thing is to found a cooperative as an organization, as an institution, and then the next step is bringing together the required capital and finding a plot of land or a building to buy as a cooperative. But yes, you have new groups also emerging, and it's a group of people that share an interest in living together and that share this interest in have a commitment towards creating non-commodifiable housing. So yes, it's a group of people. Very often you have a bit the driving forces behind. Very often are maybe architects also, people who also dare or know what it means to manage a project. Like our former student is an architect, and they are looking now for it's a cooperative in Baden, so a little bit outside of Zurich, and they would actually like to buy a house, not necessarily to build something new, because they would like to be in the city center. And there are also cooperatives that emerge and then never succeed in finding a building or finding a property and then disappear again. Also, that also happens. I wouldn't have numbers about how many new cooperatives are emerging, but they do. They are maybe sometimes fall a bit under the radar because maybe they don't become immediately members of the cooperatives association, and so I wouldn't know whether there are statistics about that. But I know of a number of cases of cooperatives like that. In Basel also, there was also an initiative of this Habitat Foundation to make land available for small cooperatives, and so quite a number of young people got together and found the new cooperatives. But then you have this one cooperative, one building model, and in terms of addressing the public need of housing, it's actually better. That was also a bit a discussion. Are cooperatives civil society organizations, meaning are they committed to create housing, to address the housing question, or are they just a clump of people interested to solve their own housing problem? And you have a bit both, you know. And in Basel, for instance, where now you have after the, you know, you have also the cooperative housing associations are very regional, and the regional housing cooperative association in Basel, which was also a bit dormant, and now it has been a sort of taken over by a new generation, and they are very much pushing also small cooperative. You know, they say what we need is big cooperatives, because the small ones, they tend, once they have solved their own housing, they are happy. So what we need is you know, these big ones who really see, especially when you address the question of affordable housing, then it's the big ones who really make a contribution to that on the long term.
Yeah, I mean, my other question is relevant to that. Who lives in cooperatives?
There is an interesting study, and I even wrote a paper about that, because it's of course a debated topic, you know, because again, you have of course the conservative, liberal conservative parties that think that the market will be doing better, and that the cooperatives get too many subsidies, which is, by the way, not true. They don't get that many subsidies at all. And they say that millionaires are living in cooperatives and so on and so forth. So if you read, you know, the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, which is a conservative liberal newspaper, you would have the impression that all millionaires are living in housing cooperatives, which some statistics show, yes, there are millionaires, because of course if you enter as a young professional or even a student in a cooperative in your life cycle, you might of course have a career path that allows you to become part of the upper middle class, but then you are a member of the cooperative. They cannot kick you out because you are a middle class person. So in that sense, if you are a member of a cooperative, no matter, you know, cooperatives are not social housing, it's housing for all. But there is a study that was published recently, that was commissioned by the city of Zurich, that shows that the average income and the median income of people living in housing cooperative is below the people living in the private sector. So in a way that this study shows, it's the socio-economically people who need affordable housing. You can say, maybe I was just now, I had to write a little paper about middle class housing, and I mean, some people would say yes, cooperatives are middle class housing, but I would say by and large it's mixed. It's rather lower middle. I mean, look, if you take income as an indicator of class, so middle, it's rather lower income groups that live in housing cooperatives. And you have, because you do have these incentives for, I mean, typically rich people want more space, want more deluxe housing. So obviously people who at a certain point, have an economic status that allows them to afford more, they will naturally move out, because the rules of that wouldn't allow you to own more than the number of rooms plus one number of household members plus one room apply to everybody. So if you are really rich and you think, well, after all, I can afford a big villa, why should I stay in a cooperative where I am allowed to consume 32 square meters per person? So there are these rules and regulations are also making a bit of a natural selection. But then, of course, you also have people who are very happy in the community in which they live, in their housing situation. I mean, we know, place attachment is strong for people. If you have been living for a whole life, if you have raised your children in a cooperative, you don't go out just because you are now in a better economic condition. So I would say it's socially mixed, but the numbers show that by and large it's people who depend on affordable housing that live in housing cooperatives, which includes lower middle income households. That's what we see, and that's in one domain. Cooperatives are not scoring very well. It's in the percentage of people with a migration background. Mm-hmm. There we have, in Zurich now it's I think 38% of the population has a migration background, does not have a Swiss passport, which is a different thing, because and in cooperatives only about 19% of the inhabitants don't have a Swiss passport. So which shows that, to know about the cooperative model, you need a certain knowledge about the housing system, you need a certain social capital, which many people, non-Swiss citizens, don't have. Cooperatives, of course, now justify themselves a little bit, saying, well, but the new generation of migrants in Switzerland are actually not migrants but expats and have higher incomes. It's true to some extent. I mean, it's true that we now have a wave of high-income migrants, and they are no more called migrants but expats. And so in that sense, the cooperatives justify a little bit themselves, but I think that is a bit not correct. There are cooperatives that expect their members, their tenants to speak German, which means that, of course, for people with a migration background, it's not so easy. And they say, because you need to know the language in order to participate. So these type of rules are, of course, very exclusive. Yeah, I mean, in that sense, it's, again, you have the progressive, new cooperatives, but you also have cooperatives that are very conservative. Not at all, in that sense, it's not at all that they are all so inclusive and progressive. No.
But, so I'm imagining who lives not in the sense of socio-economic class, but more like cultural class. I guess the large cooperatives that are very mixed and more smaller organizations like Barenstein and more similar, would that be?
No, I think all in all they are all quite mixed. Yeah, I think they are really all quite mixed. And also in terms of family types, what we see, I mean, again, this study, which I can show you, I wrote a paper about this study in English, and because the report is in German, and it shows, for instance, where there is a higher percentage of households with children in cooperatives as compared to the private sector. There is a higher percentage of single-parent households. I mean, so all these sort of indicators which have been used and are rightly used to show whether cooperatives reach out to people who need affordable housing, on all those indicators the cooperatives show well. So more families, more single-parent households, more lower-income households compared to the private sector. More people, also the average educational level is lower than in the private sector, so you have less. Even then you have less academics living in housing cooperatives compared. So it is lower middle class people tend to be the majority of the people.
Do you have any questions? I have one last question.
Well, I mean, for me, it was a bit of talking about how, like in your experience, cooperatives have adopted demographic changes such as migration, but you answered that. Do you feel that they're a bit better in terms of like gender equality? For example, you mentioned that there's more openness to single parent households.
Yeah.
Do you feel that is the case?
Yeah, I think new cooperatives, yes. You see, of course, the old cooperatives, and those who have an old housing stock, they were building for the typical families at that time. And in that sense, now you have a bit, even within the cooperative sector, a bit the mismatch between the housing stock and the demographic structure. But the new cooperatives definitely address all these different lifestyle aspirations also, from the cluster apartments to the very large apartments for Vegas, for shared living. They really try to create a very diverse typology of apartments in order to allow also a very diverse community of people to live there. And that is clearly a response to the changing social, cultural and demographic structure. And of course, the old housing cooperatives, I mean, either you demolish and you start building something completely different, but that's also something which we think is not really the right way to go now. I mean, I think even cooperatives, I know that ABZ had at some point was also very much of this, demolish and replace the old housing stock. And now they start being a bit more reluctant to do that because the trend is, it's increasingly criticized. There is increasing awareness that also from an environmental point of view, it doesn't make sense to demolish the existing housing stock. Also because the building regulations in Zurich don't really allow that much of a densification. So cooperatives are a bit in this dilemma now. I think the enthusiasm among cooperatives, the enthusiasm of demolishing and replacing has decreased. And then, of course, some cooperatives are also sitting on housing stock that is now under heritage protection. We have some of the garden city cooperatives that are not allowed to demolish, or even in the center of the city, we have some cooperatives which for them, and therefore cooperatives sometimes they are also a bit annoyed because of course it costs them a lot of money for them to refurbish them according to the heritage standards, and
What has been, for example, your experience in housing cooperatives? Do you feel that they do take post-occupancy studies into consideration?
Yes. So again, the new ones. For instance, if you see again, not all. I think the new ones are very careful about that, and the large ones probably. But yes, for instance, the Kalkbreite, they monitor very carefully who is living there. They even monitor lifestyles, since they are very committed to sustainable lifestyle. They monitor how many flights you take a year and all sorts of things. And they really they study the social demographic structure of the neighborhood and really try to replicate the same social demographic structure within their cooperative. So for instance, if an apartment becomes empty and they see that the quota of people above 80 is underrepresented, they look for a tenant within that range of so they have quotas for everything. They have quotas for the LGBTQ plus community, quota for women, single, and all. It's very strictly, and they monitor that very carefully. In that sense, it's quite a bit of social engineering, almost, you can say, and which is interesting because last year we did this study with our student in the cooperatives in Winterthur, and there was this Megelswohnen who just built a new cooperative in Winterthur, and there was another cooperative. And Megelswohnen had also this very strict policy of trying to have a certain social demographic structure of inhabitants and the other cooperative, which is called Vogelsang, said no, we randomly select our tenants, and it ended up being very similar to results. Yeah, so it is. We found that quite interesting.
That's fascinating, actually. So you mentioned that people have to have kind of like a certain knowledge about the housing system to enter the housing cooperatives. Do some of them do kind of like extensive publicity or marketing to target certain also groups?
I think the new ones. Well, marketing not really, but no, really marketing not in that sense. But cooperatives like the new ones are very much visited by outsiders, but I wouldn't say marketing, no. Sometimes, they organize maybe events where everybody is welcome, but more for the neighborhood or so, they participate in the neighborhood life, but not marketing as such. They don't need it because there is so much more demand. Many cooperatives don't accept you because you have cooperatives where you can become a member even without living there, with the hope that maybe at some point you might be able to get an apartment. And but for instance, ABZ, which is the largest cooperative, they don't accept new members. Only when they announce that there is a vacancy and they have a newsletter. Now, by the way, they are going to build the first high-rise building. I don't know whether you're aware of that. It's big. It's called Kochareal. It's
Oh yeah,
yeah,
I know,
yeah. That ABZ is building a high-rise building there, and there they already contacted us now, because they are interested in the post-occupancy evaluation, which is a bit early because they didn't start the construction. But they are about to start, but it's supposed to be finished in 3-4 years or something. And then they already contacted us because they would like to document, monitor the process, and then do later post-occupancy evaluation.
Usually, what, like a year after people move in, or?
There is no standard as such. There is no standard. Yeah, I wouldn't say that there is a clear pattern or so. But I think we were writing, we had an exchange of emails, and they said, because first they wanted a study to accompany and document the whole process of building this high-rise building, and then also due to lack of resources, they decided they only want to do a post-occupancy evaluation. They were talking about 2-3 years after. Which I guess makes sense. 1 year would be too early. Yeah. And that's an interesting building because they are really already now concerned about how can we create a community within a high-rise building. So they have every 3-4, I think they made like in every 3 floors they have one communal room and communal spaces sort of vertically integrated in the building. And it's going to be interesting because it's certainly the first building of an important size. Yeah.
That's probably interesting for you to examine too.
Yeah.
Vertical structure.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
I just have one last question in my notes. What we were talking about before, how do you define affordability?
Well, there are official definitions of what affordability means. Typically, it's interesting because normally in Europe you would say people should not spend more than 30% of their income for housing. But now I just read an article before that in Switzerland it's actually 40%, and there are statistics showing how much. I think, I was working on that right now because I have to finish this paper for a European project on middle class housing, and what was the number? So what is affordable for the poor? Obviously, what affordability means for the poor is different, and for a poor household spending more than 1/3 of the income is obviously worse than for a wealthy household. But the statistics show that in Switzerland, 38% of the lower income people spend more than 40% of their income for housing, which is high actually. I was quite surprised that it's so high. Whereas the middle class, because I was working on the middle class side, now it's only about 10% who spend more than 40%. Yeah. So affordability. So so the whole affordability discussion and affordability research is a whole discussion per se. But then what sometimes people tend a bit to confuse, even in public debates, is affordable housing versus non-profit housing. And cooperatives are non-profit, non-commodifiable housing, and I think that is the big important issue. Because you can, some housing can be affordable, but it's not adequate, and housing can be adequate but not affordable. So in a way, what matters is to have housing that is adequate and affordable. And I think cooperative housing is adequate and affordable. Whereas other housing, I think there, especially lower income people with migration background, are very often forced into housing that is maybe neither affordable and even less adequate. I was just reading also there the percentage of households living in houses with humidity problems. And it's not huge in Switzerland, but obviously it's the lower income people who live in housing with a humidity problem. And then you go up and the problem doesn't exist for higher income people. So what is affordable? There are very economic definitions of affordability, but then it doesn't tell you anything about the adequacy of the housing and whether it's commodified and whether it's can be affordable or still far too costly for what it's worth. So there is a qualitative dimension.